I left behind the blistering heat of Death Valley to start anew in the sub-zero chill of Alaska's interior. It was a move that would prove to be the most drastic change of my life, and the most terrifying. I was searching for a fresh start, something different, something that would challenge me. The town was tiny, with just a few hundred residents. Winters here were brutal. After a few days, I realized getting around would be tough without the right gear. I needed something to handle the snow and ice, something rugged. That's when I stumbled upon Clyde's ad on Craigslist. It was for a snowmobile, the kind that looked like it could handle anything the harsh backcountry could throw at it. I contacted Clyde through the ad. He responded quickly and seemed eager to sell. He mentioned he'd lived in the area for decades and that the snowmobile had served him well. He explained he didn't use it much anymore, slowing down with age. I told him I was interested, and we arranged to meet the next day. Clyde's cabin was on the outskirts, a good few miles from town. He told me to follow the main road until it ended, and then take a narrow path leading into the woods. "Can't miss it," he'd said. And he wasn't wrong. It was the only place around, ironically looking like it belonged in a horror movie, with its sagging roof, cracked windows, and an old, rusted-through pickup parked out front. I probably should have turned around right then, but alas, I didn't. I had set out early that morning, knowing the daylight hours were short this time of year. The drive was long, and the snow-covered road seemed to stretch forever, leading me to this isolated cabin. I parked and texted Clyde, letting him know I'd arrived. He replied quickly, telling me to come right up and meet him in the garage where the snowmobile was. I stepped out of the car, shivering in the cold. I wasn't used to these harsh conditions, having only been here a few days. The garage was a little ways from the cabin, hidden behind a thick cluster of trees. As I walked, an unsettling feeling crept over me. But I brushed it off and kept going. I was here to get a snowmobile. I reached the garage. It was larger than I expected. It was more like a hangar than a regular garage, spacious enough to store a snowmobile, some heavy equipment, and even a small plane. The door was partially open. I pushed it fully open and stepped inside. The snowmobile was right there, all right, but Clyde wasn't. I called out, but there was no answer. I looked around, trying to spot any sign of him, but it was pitch dark inside, with no internal light source to help. While waiting for Clyde, I started to examine the snowmobile. It was parked right near the door, with just enough light from outside to illuminate it. I turned on my phone's torch to see better, inspecting the engine and controls. Then, suddenly, the garage door slammed shut behind me. I turned quickly, my heart racing. The door's closure cut off the little light from outside, leaving me with just the dim beam from my phone's torch in the now pitch-black space. I texted Clyde, asking what was going on. No response. I tried the door, but it was locked tight. Panic set in as I realized something was very wrong. I heard a shuffling noise, followed by a low mutter. I looked around, but my flashlight didn't catch anything unusual. My mind was racing. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only answer was silence. I backed up, pressing against the wall. My mind was screaming to get out, but I was trapped. I noticed a door on the far side of the garage, partially hidden behind some old crates. I ran towards the door, hoping it would lead me outside. But about halfway to the door, something snapped around my ankle. A hunter's trap. I felt the most excruciating pain I had ever felt, shooting up my leg. A man emerged from a dim corner, his face hidden behind a ski mask. He'd been standing there all along, just out of sight. He told me to stop struggling, saying it wouldn't help. But I couldn't help it. Adrenaline surged as I fought to free myself from the trap. My phone slipped from my hand, falling to the ground. The man laughed, the most evil laugh you could imagine. I managed to pry the trap open just enough to pull my foot free. Pain shot through my leg, and I could feel blood starting to pool around my ankle. But I ignored it. I grabbed my phone and sprinted, as best I could anyway, toward the small door at the back, hoping it would be unlocked and lead to freedom. The man lunged at me, but I managed to dodge and thankfully was able to burst through the door into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me on the snowmobile. My breath fogged up the windshield, and I realized I was hyperventilating. I had to pull myself together. I called the police as soon as I felt safe to do so. Their response time wasn't the greatest. About 4 hours later, they informed me they had been to investigate, but the cabin was empty. Clyde, or whoever he was, had vanished. Inside the garage, they discovered a makeshift pulley system, a simple setup of ropes and weights rigged to pull the door shut from a distance. That explained how Clyde closed the door behind me from the other end of the garage. The place was otherwise empty except for the snowmobile, the trap, and an assortment of crates and other pieces of junk. No sign of the man, no clues left behind. I later found out the cabin had been abandoned for years. Whoever set up the Craigslist ad seemed to want to lure people like me in, and do God knows what to us. My husband and I were renovating our farmhouse, and we had decided to sell the old barn door on Craigslist, as it no longer fitted with our plans, but my husband was at work that day. A buyer had expressed interest, and normally I wouldn't invite a stranger to our home, but this was a large, heavy door that I couldn't easily move. I had no choice but to let the buyer come to me. We agreed to meet at the farmhouse at 2 p.m., and I waited nervously for their arrival. At 1:45 p.m., there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing there with his truck parked in the driveway. He said he was there to buy the barn door and admitted to being early. I told him to wait while I went to unlock the barn. As I walked back, I noticed he was lingering around the farmhouse, taking in the surroundings. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. When I showed him the barn door, he seemed satisfied, but then offered a lower price than we had agreed on. I declined, and he walked back to his truck, saying he'd think about it. A couple of hours later, I noticed a truck parked down the road, near the edge of our property. It looked just like his, a common make and model, but I couldn't see the license plate from where I was standing. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. There were many farms and ranches in the area, and trucks were a staple around here. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor or a delivery person. I didn't give it much thought, assuming it had nothing to do with the earlier visitor. But then, someone knocked on our door, catching me off guard since I wasn't expecting any visitors. My husband wasn't due home for hours. I cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. It was the man from earlier, holding a large wad of cash and looking friendly and apologetic. He yelled through the door that he was willing to pay the full price for the barn door and wanted to make the purchase. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door. As soon as I opened it, he shoved his way inside, catching me off guard. Before I could react, he pushed me to the ground, ordering me to stay put and threatening that if I moved, things would end badly. I hit the floor hard, my head spinning, feeling utterly helpless. He grabbed my phone and wallet from the coffee table and shoved them into his pocket. Then he walked over to the front door, locked it, and removed the key from the lock. Afterwards, he methodically searched the closet, scattering storage bins and linens until he found something to tie me up with, my sewing measuring tape. He returned to where I lay and began to tie my hands behind my back, telling me to shut up as I tried to speak and plead with him to stop. He demanded to know where the valuables were, but I was too terrified to answer. He tore through my belongings, searching for anything he could find. As he rummaged, I noticed his frantic, jerky movements and the sweat dripping from his brow. His eyes looking around wildly, and it struck me that he might be high on something. I hadn't noticed it before. I was too paralyzed by fear. He moved closer, pressing the knife against my throat. He demanded to know where I kept my jewelry. I tried to explain there was nothing else of value. For the next hour, he tore through our house, overturning furniture, ripping open drawers, and shattering anything in his way. He smashed picture frames, dumped out closets, and tossed everything he could find. I stayed on the floor, hands tied, heart pounding, watching in fear as he destroyed our home, desperate to find something else worth taking. He picked the wrong house, as we really had nothing worth stealing. He came back towards me, the knife now clamped between his teeth. He started to unzip his jeans. His wild eyes locked onto me. I then realized with horror that he planned to assault me. My heart pounded as I braced myself for the unimaginable. Then, the sound of a car pulling up outside startled him. He quickly rushed to go look out the window. I was praying that it was my husband, though he wasn't due home yet. He must have noticed something or someone that worried him. The man told me not to call the police, saying he'd be long gone. Then, without another word, he escaped out the back door, leaving me tied up on the floor. Seconds after he left, my husband unlocked the door and rushed in, his face immediately registering shock at the sight of me on the floor, tied up, and the overturned furniture and broken items around me. He quickly untied my hands and helped me sit up. While he checked me over for injuries, he asked what had happened. I quickly explained about the intruder, everything that had transpired, and that the intruder had just left. He grabbed the largest kitchen knife we had and immediately rushed out the back door, hoping to catch the intruder. By the time he got outside, the intruder's truck was already gone. While my husband was busy being my hero, I called the police, who arrived shortly after. They took statements from both of us, noting every detail we could remember. The crime scene unit came and dusted for fingerprints, taking a few items the intruder had touched as evidence. They assured us they would do their best to track him down, but I didn't feel much hope. It was pure luck that my husband came home from work a few hours earlier than usual that day. If he hadn't, I shudder to think what might have happened. His unexpected arrival was the only reason the intruder didn't have more time to do what he came here to do. We spent the night at a friend's house, too shaken to stay in our own home. The police kept in touch, but weeks passed with no further news. I'm a 30-year-old female, and this happened to me 5 years ago. I live in a small apartment in Richmond, which is a suburb close to the central business district in Melbourne, what you might refer to as downtown in America. I had just started a new job and was looking to upgrade my old computer monitor. Not having a lot of money to spend, I turned to Craigslist to find an affordable option. I found a few listings for cheap monitors, but one in particular caught my eye, an old but still functional LCD monitor for a fraction of the cost of a new one. I sent the owner a message and kept looking, but nothing else seemed as promising. The following morning, I got a reply. The owner introduced himself as Patrick and said he'd be happy to show me the monitor whenever I was available. There was something odd about his response. He seemed overly enthusiastic, almost like he was trying too hard. It made me a bit uneasy, but I figured maybe he was just an overly friendly guy. I told him I could come by any day after work at 7, and he suggested I stop by the next evening at 8:30, saying that he'd be back from footy training by then. He told me his address, and that was that. The next day, after work, I went home, chillaxed for a while, then I drove straight to his place. It was well and truly dark out already. I double-checked that I had enough cash on me, and then got out of my car. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was left slightly open. There was no usual fly-wire screen door either, just the main door. Thinking it might have been left open for me, I leaned in to peek inside, but I didn't initially see anyone, so I rang the doorbell. Right after the bell rang, I heard a sound coming from the back of the house. Then silence. The noise made me feel uneasy, and I suddenly got a bad feeling about the whole situation. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, I heard footsteps approaching the door. The door opened a bit wider, and a man appeared in the doorway. He greeted me with a casual "G'day" and asked, in a direct Aussie way, which isn't appropriate for the internets, what I wanted. I replied that I was there to see the monitor, trying to keep my voice steady, and reminded him that we had arranged to meet at 8:30. The man stared at me for a moment, stepped back, and asked me what the bloody hell I was waiting for, and motioned for me to come in. The instant I stepped inside, I felt something wasn't right about it. My gut told me to get the hell out of there, but I hesitated, unsure how to extract myself from the situation. The monitor was right there in the living room, just near to the entrance. He stood right by the door while I went over to have a gander. I told him I'd take it, without giving it a proper once-over, just eager to get out of there. I walked back over to him at the door and handed over the cash. He disappeared into another room for a moment to grab the power cables, then returned and handed me both the cables and the monitor. As I turned to leave, I felt bloody relieved to be getting out of there. When I got back to my flat, I decided to give the monitor a more thorough once-over, just to make sure it was right as rain. As I was having a squiz at the monitor, I stumbled upon something unexpected, a small tile device attached to the back. One of those tracking thingies, like an AirTag. Whoever attached it could see exactly where the monitor was. I felt a surge of fear when it dawned on me. What the hell was going on? The seller had been tracking the monitor, and now they could find out where I lived. The possibilities were terrifying: robbery, harassment, or worse. As I thought back to the sale, I realized I may not have noticed the tile earlier, since I had only given the monitor a quick once-over. Or maybe the seller had attached it as he passed it to me when I was leaving. I couldn't be sure. So I decided to take it to the police station and report the incident. But as I explained the situation to the cop, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was overreacting. The cop suggested it was possible the tile was left on by mistake, or that the seller might not have even known it was there. I knew he was right. There was no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. In the end, they couldn't do anything about it. Before I left, I jokingly offered to donate the monitor to them, mentioning I didn't want to find out what other surprises might be hidden inside. They laughed, but I was dead serious. And just like that, I left it with them, to use or toss, their call. The feeling of being vulnerable lingered, leaving me with more questions than answers. I didn't bother contacting the seller to ask if they knew anything about the tile. I didn't want to imply anything or give them any ideas in case it was just an honest mistake. I simply wanted to put the whole ordeal behind me and move on, but the nagging sense of unease remained. I decided to take some extra precautions. I looked into getting a dog, but my apartment complex had pet restrictions. Instead, I invested in an alarm system for the flat. It was a small comfort, but it was better than doing nothing. Anyway, I am alive to tell the story. Nothing bad happened, and I never heard from the guy again. No surprise visitors, just a strange and unsettling incident that eventually faded into a distant memory, and into this story for you all. Back when I was in college, I went to a fairly big university. I had a small apartment not far from campus and needed to find a roommate, pronto. All my friends already had places lined up, so I turned to Craigslist to put up an ad. A guy named Edgar reached out in response to the ad and asked if he could come by to check out the place. I agreed, and later that afternoon, he showed up. He seemed pretty ordinary. Nothing particularly stood out about him. He mentioned he wasn't a student, but worked at the university as a janitor. Edgar seemed nice enough on the surface. Our conversation was normal, but for some reason, I couldn't shake this odd feeling about him. I didn't know what it was, just a sense of discomfort I couldn't put my finger on. After he looked around, he thanked me and left, and I told him I'd let him know soon if his application was successful. I was hesitant, not fully convinced at that time, hoping for another candidate. The following morning, I was struggling to get out of bed and was channel hopping on my small TV in my bedroom when I ended up on the news. They were covering a story about a recent assault case, and to my horror, they were reporting on the arrest of a suspect. When his photo appeared on the screen, I froze. It was Edgar, the same guy who had been at my apartment only the day before. I was in disbelief. I never contacted him again, and I probably couldn't anyway if he was behind bars. Fortunately, someone else had reached out later that day, and we hit it off. They moved in shortly afterward. I guess Edgar found accommodation after all. Just not the kind he was hoping for.